everyone. My name is Nishant Aswani. I'm a PhD student at NYU Tandon as well as NYU Abu Dhabi. I'm excited to present at the conference here today. As Tyler mentioned, I'm presenting examining changes in internal representations of continual learning models through tensor decomposition, and we'll sort of break down what all of that means. And throughout this talk, I really hope to be able to walk us through our thinking process as we came up with this project and the steps we took to get to where we are now. In standard learning, models are trained on the entire data set at once, typically. We often shuffle and intermix classes to ensure a comprehensive training experience. But as we're familiar with the continual learning paradigm, we intentionally segment our data set into tasks. Tasks may consist of a class that will never be seen again by the model. But the really important thing here is the model learns these tasks in a sequence, which is a departure from the all-at-once approach. This sequential training allows us to observe the model's behavior over time, introducing the opportunity for us to ask questions in the temporal dimension. So you can ask questions like, what does the model look like after task 1? Or how did it change between task 1 and task 2? And often we're not just dealing with one continual learning strategy or one model architecture. We have a variety of pairings that we can study. So what we really need is a way to pull all of this information together, a framework of sorts that lets us see how different continual learning strategies play out across various architectures. This way we can perhaps spot some patterns or similarities across the board. And in our case, for this project, we are studying computer vision models. That's where we limited ourselves in terms of scope. And so the ultimate goal is to build a framework or a method to answer the questions that I showed in the previous slide. But in order to study models, we actually first need to train models. So based on my anecdotal experience, model training on fewer classes in the initial task doesn't always develop a feature-rich representation as those models trained on the full data set. And since our study here leans a bit into explainability and interpretability, we want more control over what the model picks up instead of leaving it up to chance or some random seed. So to achieve this, we propose using a t-SNE embedding of the data set to get a sense of which classes are separated from each other. t-SNE gives us the broad strokes, so we end up selecting very dissimilar classes and using that as the first task. So as you can see here in the green box, it's trying to represent that we want to get a diverse group of classes from our data set, from our typical computer vision data set, and put that into the first task. And once we train our model, standard continual learning setting, the simplest setting, we can probe the model for its intermediate representations. And we're not limited to the end results. We can actually take snapshots of the model at any stage of the learning process. And we're also offered the flexibility to choose any intermediate layer in the model. Given the model snapshots and activations, we can build a collection of the model's internal states as it updates over time. So here's this is what I'm trying to represent here in the gray box. Is if you were to store a copy of the model after each task or after every X epochs, you could then probe each of those snapshots and get a collection of internal representations across time. And what that allows us to do is maybe ask some questions across time, right? But at this point, we still have a few details that need to be hammered out. Initially, the first thing is which inputs do we use for probing the models? If we want these activations, these intermediate activations, we need to figure out what we feed into the model. And which strategy should we be looking at to begin with? I mean, so far everything is strategy agnostic, but it makes sense to sort of narrow down and study a subset. And given that we can collect these internal states, what are the questions we can ask with this representation of data? And we'll tackle all of these details in the next slides. So first up, which inputs? right? And there are a few methods we can employ to determine the representative inputs for each class. And if I haven't, hopefully I've been clear so far, but the idea is we want to, going back to this slide, we want to actually grab intermediate representations of a class, of a certain class, right? And so the goal is, how do we find the representative inputs? We can't just, it'd be silly to sort of feed the entire all the samples of a class in from the data set. So we can do random sampling. That is a really straightforward approach, pretty naive approach, but we essentially just randomly select a subset of images from each class. Another thing you could do is search the data set for the images that maximally activate the final model. So if I'm interested in representative inputs for the dog class, what I might do is search the data set for all dog images and then see which images maximally activate the dog class in the classifier head. And let's say I limit myself to the 20 top images that do so. And another thing you can do, which is a bit more involved, is to find to sort of optimize an image. And I wish I could go into the details of what that means here, but if you're interested, there's this link I've attached to the bottom by Chris Ola. This still is a wonderful website focused on interpretability research. Ultimately, our goal is to find images that best represent each class. So we will explore all of these in our project. And the next thing we have to tackle or sort of detail to hammer out is, which strategies do we want to study? So far, everything we've discussed is strategy agnostic, but it makes sense to sort of pick an area of continual learning. And for our project, we chose importance-based methods because these methods often explicitly attempt to manipulate the model to foster some sort of subnetworking. And to me personally, these important methods are intriguing because they represent some sort of effort to make an efficient use of what's already available there. So there's no, some of you might be familiar with architecture expansion techniques where you're sort of adding in more resources as you learn. And to me, just the idea of being able to efficiently subnetwork is a very neat, is a neat concept. And so I wanted to sort of explore that, especially in resource constrained systems. Right. So given that we've narrowed down to importance-based methods, and we have a general idea of how we're going to find the inputs, it felt reasonable to ask whether we could see specialized groups of neurons for a specific class or a specific task. Basically, can we point to a subset of neurons inside our model that do the heavy lifting for a certain task or maybe a certain class? And in a very similar vein, it also felt pretty natural to ask how the components of a layer, say the filters of a CNN model, how do they update across time? Do all of these filters learn simultaneously, or is there some kind of staggered learning that's happening? So if we're looking at a layer of our choice in a CNN and we're learning with an important base strategy, I'm sort of rephrasing the question here. Does each filter learn something about all of the classes, or does each filter specialize in a class or task, right? And if I really had to summarize both of these hypotheses, I would say, do we see a division of labor? And so that's sort of what we are aiming for here. So coming back to this image, I do want to note a caveat here. So I presented a couple of hypotheses in the previous slide, and this graphic here really is relevant to the first hypothesis. You can very much answer the second hypothesis, and we plan to, but you just need a few tweaks in the graphic visualization here. Just a caveat I want to note. Anyways, despite all of these details we just hammered out, we still need to figure out how to summarize this tensor that we obtain at the right here. Like, how do we get some insights out of this tensor? So far, it's just been a setup of this framework. And in order to do that, we turn to tensor component analysis, which is a way for us to summarize our tensor through dimensionality reduction. And I'll sort of go into the details of what TCA means. But TCA is a mathematical tool that approximates a three-way tensor as a sum of rank 1 tensors. And each rank 1 tensor is an outer product of 3 vectors. We typically refer to each rank 1 tensor as a component. So I'm going to start using the terminology component moving forward in case that becomes confusing. When I'm talking about component, I'm actually just referring to, if you see my mouse here, these RGB, these outer product of these vectors, that's one component. And TCA can return as many components as you want it to return. So it's a hyperparameter for this this technique. So what you can do is with TCA is you can actually plot all of these 3 vectors that come out of it. You can plot them on a 1D axis and sort of try to figure out if there are patterns there. And we'll look at a more concrete example, but in the next slide. But right here, what I want to show you is, so this is from a paper by Williams et al. I've cited down there. But what they did was, in a neuroscience study, they collected neuron responses across time for several trials. And you can see those are the 3 dimensions. And we have a similar setup, right? We have 3 dimensions in our tensor as well. And they use TCA. So this is the dimensionality reduction arrow right here to obtain a bunch of components. And right now they're just highlighting a single component. But what that sort of looks like in another study is these plots on the right here. And I'm going to take a minute to sort of walk through what this actually means. So to give you some background, what this study did was they measured cell responses in mice across learning stages. And these cell responses were for several input cues. So it's, again, a very similar setting to ours. Instead of cell responses for us, it's neural activations, which you can see there's some sort of you may be able to view some sort of parallel there between artificial and biological networks. We also have some kind of response we're trying to study across stages. And instead of cues, we refer to ours as class representative inputs. And as you can see here, so they used non-negative TCA, which gives more interpretable components. Here you see that in the top row, a certain group of cells has been selected for. And you can see how their response changes across time. So this red graph here is actually time responses. And you can see that these cells that have been selected are selected for a specific input cue. And you sort of, right here, we see 4 components, but the researchers had several components, up to 9, I believe. They experimented, and that's something we have to experiment with as well. But it really gives this interpretable understanding of what is going on in the model. Like here, they're able to now perhaps make a claim that there are certain cells inside the visual association cortex, the visual cortex of mice that specialize for certain input cues. And this is how their response changes across time. And this is something we want to do for artificial networks, especially since we have, in the continual learning setting, the temporal dimension. So I'm showing the full picture here now. But essentially, if you use TCA on this tensor we created in the gray box up here, we end up with, hopefully, several interpretable components. And what an exciting result would look like in our case, I'm going to highlight this column right here. We could see very clear activity, for example, here for certain activations. And we see that it's selected for a certain class. And we can also see which model snapshot, or when in time that activity is maximized, right? And so that would sort of imply that these activations are corresponding to a certain class. So that is sort of the general framework we build to study. And here, this purple box at the end. So a lot of this is, as you may have noticed, pretty qualitative. And so to bring it sort of into the quantitative world, so we can talk a bit about numbers, is okay, once we figure out certain neurons are specialized for certain tasks, hopefully, if we see those results, we can actually mask those neurons out and see, okay, if we feed in those class representative inputs, it should actually perform terribly if we masked out those very important neurons. So why is this study important? I want to study, and our group wants to study specialization because it suggests efficient resource allocation. And the study might also give us some insight about whether there's room to improve importance-based methods, or do we just need a completely different angle of attack to elicit specialization? And a couple more obvious reasons to study this maybe are just sort of naive questions about how similarly do different strategies learn, or how similarly do different architectures learn. But yeah, so thank you for hosting me. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, or if you're ever in Abu Dhabi, be more than welcome to have a chat. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nishant, for the interesting presentation.